Greetings, Internet. This is a video I've wanted to make for a while. Originally, I thought it would fall completely under the scope of the whole digital media versus physical media debate that you've probably seen on a lot of retro channels, gaming in particular. But after a few things that I've read in recent times, I wanted to still touch on that, but then expand upon it. But first, I need to run the risk of being a bit like a first-year college student trying to pad an essay and trying to sound smarter by filling the beginning of their work with definitions of terms. But at the risk of being pedantic, I feel like I need to kind of reset some parameters and definitions of the terms we're going to be throwing around here, particularly digital media and physical media. Now, it's an interesting case with video games because fundamentally, all video games are digital media. You cannot interact with video games without the use of a computer. It's all digital, digits, binary. The only thing computers can fundamentally understand. So what we're talking about, at least with video games, physical media, is distribution. This is a physically distributed piece of software. Now, of course, there's the tangible box, and of course there's the artwork that you can display and appreciate. And of course you can interact with the cartridge, but really, although it looks cool, it is just a shell to protect the software etched into the circuit board within. And of course, there's a manual. For me, there's something to be said. I'd rather read these on paper than look at yet another screen, especially a smartphone. Who wants to use that piece of crap more than they have to? It's bad enough if you have video gaming as a hobby that a lot of your time is already spent looking at a screen. I don't need to look at more screens just to get the most out of it. But the cartridge is private property. Now, technically and legally, the software contained within, in this case, is Sega's property. They're the only ones legally that have a right to sell it and distribute it. I don't think anyone is missing the plots by saying that they own this, though. Because, like, legalities aside, I think everyone understands fundamentally on some level. It's like, yeah, you don't own the intellectual property of Sonic the Hedgehog, only Sega does. And there's some people that have tried to argue that, like, well, technically, by the law, companies even have the right, if they wanted to, revoke your access to it, to come into your home and remove the software from the cartridge or the disc and make it unusable. It's like, I don't think that would ever hold water, even if a company was determined to do that and didn't mind the PR nightmare that would ensue, and didn't mind incurring the expense. That would still be willful destruction of private property, and that would never hold up. Well, and maybe it would in the most corrupt of all courts, but, I digress. But the point is that you have control over this, and that's what these modern companies really can't seem to stand. Is I don't need internet access to use this. I don't need an account. I don't have to have agreed to some unfair and arbitrary and ridiculously convoluted terms and conditions and license agreements to just put the cartridge into a Mega Drive or its equivalent and interact with the software. So then, digital media is, again, coming back to distribution. It's something that was delivered to you by direct download or a streaming service. But digital media is not some magic, ethereal thing. Like, the information being passed from computer to computer, it can't be utilized while en route. Our brains can't intercept it. We need a computer to capture it and then reinterpret it back to us as intended. And once it exists on your hard drive, fundamentally, it doesn't work really so differently, if at all, from plugging in a cartridge or popping a disk into an optical drive. So again, it's all about distribution. That's the way we need to frame the discussion. Now, other media, besides video games, we have to tweak the discussion because music, drawing, painting, film, all these other works of art existed before computers. They can still exist without computers. They have been digitized, but they don't have to be digital to exist. Video games occupy an interesting place there because fundamentally they're all digital. So, where am I going with this now that we've reframed the discussion? Well, the reality is that all physical objects are as vulnerable as we are to entropy. As sad as it is to think of, even one of the most beautiful discs, such as Panzer Dragoon here, I don't know if you can see all the detail, is perhaps inevitably faced with a future of disk rot. Now, we don't know exactly what the final lifespan is of all optical media. Of course, Blu-rays are much sturdier and more durable, and almost certainly have a much longer life ahead of them than Laserdiscs, a lot of which are still kicking, but then CD-ROMs, GD-ROMs, mini-discs, DVDs, so forth. We don't know for sure. And while I think the doomsayers are pretty quick to exaggerate this, epidemic, they like to call it, of disk rot, it is sadly pretty inevitable, unless we come up with some new techniques for preservation purposes. But, the floppy disks that I have, inevitably, they will lose the ability to retain the data on them. My VHS tapes, after a certain number of uses, they'll start to deteriorate and lose their quality. And unfortunately, even if they're not used but sparingly, are probably still vulnerable to a gradual deterioration. It's sad, but it's just something we have to accept. Cartridges are interesting. People were pretty quick to bash them once CD-ROM technology became commonplace. And of course, made fun of Nintendo for holding on to the format as long as they did. Jury's out on how long these things can really last, as long as you keep them away from moisture and don't let them get corroded or anything like that. Obviously they're not invincible, but I have made the joke before on my channel that these things, and probably that Sega Genesis over there, will outlive me. It was a running joke for a while, but the further I go in this journey, the more I realize it's probably true. But they still have, unfortunately, an endpoint somewhere down the line. The thing is, why does that matter so much? And why would you jump on a bandwagon of being a doomsayer and be like, the end is nigh, physical media is dying, you better just jump on headfirst into digital everything? Well, guess what? It took corporate America all of about 5 seconds to ruin digital distribution of media. Just take a look around. I, for a while, embraced digital and streaming. When Netflix first offered streaming of movies and TV shows, I was all in. Now, granted, looking back, of course, the price was way lower, and the service was pretty robust and offered a huge selection. You didn't have to have multiple streaming services to get most of what you could possibly want. But at the same time, it was a rental service. It still is. The entire, like, digital economy is basically one big-ass rental service. You know, obviously, if you sail the high seas, it's probably not something you need to concern yourself with. And of course, if you buy games from sites like GOG, you don't have to worry about DRM. So it's probably about as good as buying a game physically as far as your control over what you do with it on your own computer or gaming system, which is a specialized form of computer. Let's be clear. But again, look around. We have a freaking oligarchy to deal with here, so I think as well with the threats of censorship and control and having the deck massively stacked against the little person, the customer, as far as, you know, the way they interact with their media. I think physical media is more important than ever, and it needs to remain so. At least until we can sort more of this stuff out and make things actually fair for the customer, or I don't really want to use the term consumer because I can't stand it, but that's the parlance that most of you are familiar with. Do we really want a handful of mega corporations and conglomerates to have basically unfettered control over history, art, culture, our entertainment, with the ability to pluck out and censor whatever they feel like, or whatever is inconvenient to the powers that be? I don't think that's a good proposition. So for all its limitations and frailties and vulnerabilities, nobody can reach in and censor this. Not that anyone really needs to censor Sonic the Hedgehog, conceivably, but, you know, I think you can extrapolate my meaning. But, you know, nobody can just reach in and hack this to bits, or take out something that they think is politically or otherwise inconvenient to them. You know, the company can't just shut off my access to it because I don't have to, again, I don't have to have an account or subscription service to use this. So yeah, it's just as vulnerable as anything else to natural disaster, to entropy, to accidents. But then again, the computer that hosts all the files, all the digitized versions of the media that you enjoy, is equally vulnerable to disaster and accident and entropy. With the added bonuses of malware and spyware and, you know, having your data harvested to be used by the aforementioned profit-seeking, blood-sucking mega corporations. So again, it's one of those things that until we suss it out, I feel like people on either extreme should probably sit down and shut up for a minute. The people that advocate for all digital, just abandon everything. And then the people on the other far ends, the physical media champions that vilify everything digital. It's like, well, hold on, you know, pump the brakes here. I think both extreme ends chill out and realize there's some nuance to this whole thing, right? I propose a bit of a thought experiment here as well, because I feel like although we started this with video games and entertainment and things that a lot of people are still very quick to snub their nose at or think that's not that important, but like, this has deeper roots. Imagine when the printing press was invented and books, literature, education was finally made available not just to a handful of elites, and the powers that be, but to the masses, to all the common folk. But imagine the kind of mentality you would have to criticize that from the angle of like, oh, well, it looks like these books, they're not gonna last forever. Oh, geez, you know, as soon as there's a natural disaster, there they go. Like, people didn't just give up on it. They made more. And technology advanced so that each iteration got better, more durable, less susceptible to accidents and entropy. You know, books are still as vulnerable as ever to things like fire and floods and all that, but we didn't just give up on it completely. There's value to this. And it's not capitalistic value. It's information, education, entertainment. It's a footnote of culture and art in tangible form. We can explore a point in history or a fantastic universe that an author has concocted and invited us to be immersed within. We don't just throw it away just because, well, now there's a more convenient way. Like, yeah, that has its uses. I'm not completely trying to demonize e-readers or anything. It's like, again, we didn't just give up on the format just because, oh, big surprise, it's just as vulnerable as we humans are to existing in this world and in this universe with a very definite set of limitations. And I feel like when you have that mentality and you give in to the doom and gloom, and you also just willingly give in to the rat race of always chasing the newest and greatest tech and just throwing away everything that came before because, oh, it's all that. Who cares? Aside from being completely wasteful, there's a deeper problem. I feel like you can't help but invite that mentality elsewhere. Oh, well, why should you get attached to anyone? Why should you make friends? They're just gonna die. Why should you get involved in anyone else's life? There'll be an inevitable point where it just rots and falls away. Why have a pet? You're probably gonna outlive them. Why bother? Eh. Why enjoy this? It's just gonna rot someday. Why value it? Why cherish it? Why want to do your best to pass it on, at least to the next generation? And you know what? Even if it did rot within my lifetime, let's just be very generous and say the end of my lifetime. What's really wrong with letting people who love it, like me, to just enjoy it? And do our best to pass on to the next generation what it is that we cherish about these formats and these interpretations of art and culture. What's so bad about that? And again, this is something I've touched upon very briefly before, but I really want to lay it out more clearly. That until there is substantial, provable, testable evidence to the contrary, we only have one life. I've accepted that there's very likely less time ahead of me than there has been behind me. So I need to make the most of every moment. I need to love what I love, unapologetically, and as fiercely as possible. Whether that's inanimate objects, whether you want to accuse me of like, oh, you're just hoarding plastic and glass, it's like, I could say the same thing to you if you have nothing but digital goods on your computer. You're just collecting a hunk of plastic and metal and glass that's housing bits of information. So, if you want to make that argument, don't bother. But really, what's wrong with that? Enjoying what you enjoy. Loving what you love. And that extends to people as well. There's only so much time. Cherish the people that mean the most to you. And that means more than just liking their posts on social media. Tell people that you love them. Give someone a hug. Spend time with someone. If video games are your favorite hobby, play a game with them. Just let them know what they mean to you. So, I'm not perfect. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm not always going to live up to the very things that I'm saying here. But I'm going to try. So I invite you, whether you're a gamer or not, retro gamer, modern gamer, or just someone who appreciates media in general, and more broadly even than that, as a human being, I ask you, what are you going to do with the time you have left?